back to my channel. Today's video is a care collaboration with Matt by Nature, Patricia's Orchids, and Ninja Orchids, and we're going to be discussing how we care for Rupicolous Laelia orchids. The orchid that I will be discussing today is the Laelia Alaorii variation Orlata. So this is an orchid that I got from Peter Lynn over at Diamond Orchids. He specializes here in the United States in miniature orchids, and this is my very first Laelia orchid. Now, Rupicolous Laelias are known for growing in rocks, but this one in particular I have potted up in bark, and I find that it's doing very well. So when I received this orchid, normally when I first started growing, I'd immediately repot, but I'm finding that when I get an orchid that looks like it's established well, that the media looks nice and fresh, I usually keep it in the mix. So this one looked like it was freshly repotted when I received it, and it has 2 new growths coming in. Now, Rupicolous Laelias are known for outgrowing their pots because they continue to grow sideways. So I think after these growths come in, which you could see are in the opposite sides, I'm going to have to put this in a larger pot. However, I'm very, very excited to get blooms on this one, and I hope that I get a bloom here and I get another bloom on the other new growth. So with each new growth, you typically get 1 flower on this orchid. Put a picture up so you can see it. This orchid has bloomed before, not in my care, but it had a spike when I received it, and it looks like it was from the nursery when it had bloomed. But what I can say about the culture of this orchid is that it really likes its moisture. So the reason I can tell you this is I went away on a trip for 8 days, and I assumed that this Laelia could withstand cattleya conditions. And you guys know that if you grow orchids, cattleyas are very tough. Dendrobiums are tough. These are orchids that have storage systems in their canes, and they can go a really long time without being watered. And normally, for me, it's not an issue. I just figure, okay, it's probably even good to give some of these orchids a dry spell. That was not the case for this orchid, and you could see a little bit of what happened when I was gone. So this orchid got no water for 8 days, and when I came home, all of the leaves were extremely wrinkled. And it was unfortunate. I did research on this variation, and I found that this is a very thirsty orchid. It requires high moisture levels. So I did set it back a little bit by not watering it as much as I wanted. So something that I'll call out for home growers of the Laelia Alaorii is make sure that you're giving it adequate moisture. This orchid acts more like an oncidium in terms of the water requirements than a cattleya, so that's something to keep in mind. I do have this orchid right next to my cattleyas, but I may reduce the light and see how it goes, just because I've noticed excessive anthocyanin on the leaves. This may or may not be a good thing, but I think I shouldn't have assumed that this orchid would react just as well to cattleya conditions. That was an assumption that I shouldn't have made. So I'd say that this orchid likes more moderate light than extremely bright cattleya vanda type lights. I still have it under highlights, and I'm watching the anthocyanin very closely, but I think I'm going to move it. Just like if you see the undersides of the leaves, it is quite purple. So I'm trying to be as careful as possible. I don't want to give this orchid too much light, but I think I'm going to end up moving it. I do fertilize this orchid just like any other orchid that I have. Typically in the winter, I give it 150 parts per million of MSU fertilizer. And when it's in active growth, I give it about 250 to 350 parts per million, depending on my mix that day. But I give it MSU fertilizer. In the summer, I do include some kelp in there. Once in a while, I'll include an extra dose of CalMag, and my orchids tend to do very well. I expect this orchid to be no different with regards to the feeding regime. What I'll say though, since it's relatively new to my collection and it's a smaller orchid, I will just watch the leaves and see if I need to make any adjustments. I do really like this orchid. It's got beautiful, beautiful flowers, and I'm very interested in getting more Rupicolous Laelias. I may repot it into lava rock when it's ready for a repot, because then it won't need as much repotting time as any of my other orchids. But for now, it seems nice and happy in this bark mix. I just have to be very cognizant of watering it and make sure that it stays pretty moist. So to recap how I take care of this orchid, it's getting bright cattleya lights, but I will be moving it to more moderate lights in the future, just because of the leaves. They have a lot of anthocyanin in them. So in short, to recap how I take care of this orchid, it's in bright cattleya type lights. I may experiment moving it to more moderate lights. I give it feeding just like my other orchids. And this orchid is very, very thirsty, so it needs watering a couple times per week. I try not to let it get dry, just given that when I was away for 8 days, I think I set it back a little bit and all of the leaves were dry. So one thing that I'd like to reiterate with this orchid is that the Laelia Alaorii does not like being dry whatsoever. Do not assume that cattleya type conditions are the same for Laelia orchids. That's a mistake that I made, and a mistake that I hope that those of you who are watching this video won't make. Had I known this orchid was going to be so thirsty, I would have topped it off with sphagnum moss and make sure that I soaked it for a while, for a couple of hours before going away on vacation. So this orchid does not like to be thirsty. You could still sort of see the impact of the trip. This is an older leaf, but as you can see, it's a little bit wrinkled. Some of the newer leaves are slightly wrinkled. It's bouncing back, but when I first saw it after coming back for 8 days after not watering, it was certainly very dehydrated. I think it could help if I had more humidity as well, but otherwise, I think it'll be just fine. It'll recover. It's got 2 new growths coming in, which I think is fantastic. And I do mist it every day to raise the ambient humidity as much as possible. Well, I hope you guys liked this video. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments down below. And if you liked this video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more orchid updates. Do check out the videos that I have linked down below. All of us have very different growing environments, so what I may experience, other growers may not, because care is very environment dependent, so I encourage you to check out the other videos.